we've got another IFB King James Onlyist out there doing his thing. And this is just a 2-minute little thing, so that way we can do it quickly. But I just felt badly for the young guy. He does have a nice beard, so he can't be super young, super young. But I saw somewhere he was a youth minister, and I always feel for youth ministers. I won't go into that particular discussion right now, but anyway, he's attempting to tell people about biblical history, and just had some real problems getting it all straight. So I want to help provide some corrections. So let's listen to what he has to say.
Let's talk about where the King James Bible came from and where every other version came from. Okay, there's two different texts, Greek and Hebrew texts that every single Bible that we use modernly came from.
Okay, first correction. He says Greek and Hebrew text. That's simply not true. The Textus Receptus is not a Hebrew text. The Textus Receptus is a Greek text. This is what most people call the Textus Receptus. There is no one Textus Receptus. This is Scrivener's edition based upon the King James translation, but there is no one TR. But this is what most people are thinking of, and it's English. There is no Hebrew in it. The difference between what would be considered the standard Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia today and what was used at the time of the King James, I think adds up to exactly 8 differences between them. They're pretty much identical to one another. So that's first correction. The Textus Receptus is Greek only. It is not Greek and Hebrew.
Every Bible either came from the Textus Receptus, who was written by Erasmus, or the...
Okay, the Textus Receptus is not something that's written by someone. When you have a Greek text where you are using multiple manuscripts, as he did, certainly not as many as this guy's going to say, but multiple manuscripts as he did, you're compiling, you're editing, you're not writing, and he's later going to use the term translated. That's not it either. So he was actually working on a diglot, and his emphasis initially in the first few editions was upon the Latin, because that's where there was a little bit more danger in that, because he was altering the Vulgate text, and the Vulgate was considered the sort of the official text of the church, and so that was pretty dangerous to do. But it's not written by somebody. And of course, even the one that we have today also went through editing by Stephanus and especially by Theodore Beza. So none of that terminology would be accurate.
Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which was written by Westcott and Hort.
Okay, so here again is King James Onlyists, especially who will read Burgon, or what's worst with King James only folks is they read someone who read someone who read someone who read someone. And by the time it gets down to that level, you get this kind of almost gibberish where it just doesn't make any sense anymore. But like I keep saying, these guys are 100 years behind. The modern, here's modern Greek text. This is the Tyndale House New Testament. This is not just a reproduction of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And especially when you look at ECM, which is still being produced, but Mark and Acts and the general epistles are out, you have thousands of manuscripts that are being utilized by these texts. And so the idea that it's just Sinaiticus Vaticanus, totally ignoring the papyri, totally ignoring when the papyri, key texts like John 1:18, where P66 and P75 have demonstrated that the readings found in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are extremely ancient and early, back to the beginning of the first century. This kind of material just it's completely lost. These folks just don't know what this is all about, because they're reading somebody who read something from Dean Burgon at the end of the 19th century, and they're literally over 100 years behind where things actually are. And so their descriptions just have no connection to reality at all.
Now, first, let's talk about the Textus Receptus. The King James Bible is the only current English Bible that comes from the Textus Receptus,
which is causing all the poor good men who worked so hard on the New King James Version of the Bible to go, hey, what about us? No, the King James is not the. Well, you could make an argument. There's no way that he knows this is Scrivener. Okay, first of all, but you could make the argument that at least as far as this is concerned, this is based on the King James. So, but no, the New King James likewise is based upon the Textus Receptus as its base text. So yeah, no.
Now, here's a little bit about the TR, the Textus Receptus. Erasmus, the way he translated the TR was he gathered approximately 5,000 manuscripts of Scripture. He gathered them far and wide, everywhere he could.
Erasmus right now is very happy. Erasmus is like, yay, I did, huh? Again, this does illustrate something that I think is somewhat important, and that is that the work that we can do today, where you literally can catalog almost 5,800 fragments of the New Testament and know where they are, and massive collation work has been done for the ECM, the CBGM databases, things like that. But that could only have happened in the past 20 years. It could not have happened before then. Information technology was not such that would allow the collation and the collecting of all that much information. In fact, people think about Tregelles, Tischendorf. They think about some of those early texts and how few manuscripts were actually involved. And then you look at the work that Hoskier did on Revelation, and that was the first, at the time anyways, complete collation of one book. And then, of course, more discoveries are made, and it's no longer a complete collation. But the point is, Erasmus had between 6 and 12 manuscripts, not 5,000. There was no place in the world, no one in the world in Erasmus's day had any earthly idea how many Greek manuscripts still existed at that point. Some of those Greek manuscripts have been destroyed by fire, flood, war since then. And many others have been found that were not known at that time. And so the only guess I can take, because again, he's got some notes over here on his right-hand side. My guess is you heard somebody say something, who said something, and you're 3 or 4, steps down the road now, and things start getting muddled and confused. My guess is he's heard someone say that the Textus Receptus represents the Byzantine text type, which it does generally. It's not the best. It's not the earliest form of the Byzantine. It's not even the best form. It's sort of one thread of the Byzantine text type that's really based in about the 12th century or so. So it's really not even the best representative of the Byzantine by any standard. But he probably heard somebody say that the Byzantine represents, 5,000 of the 5,800 manuscripts. And so he somehow, not having obviously read any of Erasmus or anything like that, hasn't read Erasmus complaining about how many manuscripts he thought he'd find in Basel, Switzerland in the library and he didn't find, and so on and so forth. He's probably conflating all this stuff together and saying, oh, if it represents 5,000, then Erasmus had 5,000. Can you imagine a single person collating 5,000 manuscripts? We've got some of the best computing power in the world working on it, and still we haven't actually done that in a total fashion. I mean, the ECMs could be close to that, but one guy who complained that as he stood working on what he did do with his 6 to 12 manuscripts at most, was complaining that the fleas were biting him and that they were actually demons. Yeah, no. The very idea that you could do 5,000, could collate 5,000 manuscripts at that time gives you an idea of what's really going on here.
And everywhere he could find them, and he compiled about 5,000 different manuscripts. And what he did was he compared every single one of them.
Every single one of them. We are talking it would take one person 3-4 lifetimes to actually do that to any meaningful level.
And he had help with this, of course. And he found about 2% of them didn't line up together, didn't match identically. And so what he did with those 200%, or those 2%, was he threw the 2% out, which obviously human error and corruption, obviously there would be a percentage of them that didn't line up. But
okay, so I think what's happening here is he's hearing, well, the older texts, quote unquote Alexandrian texts, so on and so forth, only represent like 2%, and so Erasmus had no earthly idea about any of that stuff. None. If you say he did, prove it. There was no way on the small number of manuscripts he had that he could have identified text types and any of that kind of stuff. This is pure mythology based on ignorance of the historical sources and stuff like that. But then this gets repeated over and over and over again. And once you get 3 or 4 steps down the road, it starts getting a little rancid.
But that 98% of the 5,000 manuscripts that he got, which contained the whole Bible.
Notice the whole Bible. So now, poor Erasmus, man, this guy never slept, he never ate. He's doing the whole Bible. He's doing the Old Testament too. So he had Old Testament manuscripts somehow. Maybe it was the Greek Septuagint. I don't know. I'm not sure. Most King James Onlyists don't think the Septuagint existed, but that's the only thing he would have had. But hey, I don't know.
Lined up exactly, word for word exact. And that's where we get the Texas.
Word for word exact. Now, the fact is, we've identified almost all the manuscripts that he used, and they are not word for word exact. That's the problem. He had to do textual criticism. This is where you get the same kind of, in the early church, when people thought the Greek Septuagint was the standard, they told stories about how, the 70 scholars went into their caves and they came back out and they had a word, it was word for word identical, which means God inspired it, so on and so forth. That's how stories like this happen. There are no 2 manuscripts that are word for word exact, and none of the manuscripts that he used were word for word exact. Remember, he only had 1 manuscript for Revelation. It wasn't even a manuscript. It's commentary in Latin. But still, he had to make decisions, even between his own manuscripts. And the scary thing was, the best manuscript he had was the one he trusted least. It was the oldest. It was the best. And the TR would be a much better text if he had actually trusted it. But he didn't. So there you go.
And this is the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Now, these manuscripts were found inside of a Catholic monastery.
So notice what happens here is, instead of recognizing that Vaticanus has been known even in the days of Erasmus, and that Erasmus himself asked Bombastius, his friend in Rome, to look things up in the Vatican manuscript. They don't ever want to admit that. It's just a lapse of... No. Erasmus knew that there was a very ancient manuscript. They didn't know how ancient. They didn't know exactly how old it was. But it was known in the days of Erasmus. So that's in the Vatican Library. And that's a long ways from St. Catherine's Monastery. So he's conflating Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and the story of the finding of Sinaiticus with evidently Vaticanus being with it or something, I guess. It's hard to say, because, anybody who knows the history is just going, what? Where did this come from?
They were found with 14,800 alterations and corrections within the document itself.
So this is probably in reference to either marginal notes, corrections between lines, and given that these are both... Now, I'm not sure if he's just talking about, because he seems confused as to whether he's talking about the New Testament, Old Testament, but given the number of not only pages involved, but then how long these were used, That makes perfect sense. And that's why, entire books have been written on the various scribes of Sinaiticus and the different inks they used and how many hundreds of years after the original writing you have editing being done. And this is what this whole, at least, thank you. Well, maybe later on he goes into it. I don't know. But I only have this one clip. But at least he didn't go into the stuff about Sinaiticus being a forgery and Simonides and all the rest of that silly stuff that people are throwing around today.
When they found these, when Westcott and Hort, when they found these, they had.
So when Westcott and Hort found these, Westcott and Hort, of course, compiled a Greek New Testament in the 19th century, and this was they're after Tischendorf, long after the finding of Vaticanus. They were not involved in the finding of Sinaiticus and things like that. So again, we have just a whole lot of historical mythology flowing together here.
Scribbles, they had erasures, they had 14,800 different issues, contradictions.
Okay, they were not contradictions, but I guess the idea being, well, they're variants, and therefore, there you go. So, we'll have to listen to the next one and see what comes out of that, and see if there's more fun, interesting stuff to encounter. But this is one of the things, real quickly, and I know we've got callers. We're going to go to them right away. This is one of the things that's a little bit scary about the IFB King James Only stuff, is that these guys, since they're afraid to listen to what's outside, then they just keep regurgitating their own stuff, and it ends up losing accuracy over time. It doesn't become more accurate. It's not iron sharpening iron. It's water dulling iron and turning it to rust, basically. And you end up with this kind of just really, really, really bad information. So I'm hoping the brother might think through some of his claims and maybe do some reading outside the IFB world, and that would be helpful at that point in time.